The afternoon sun streamed through the small oval windows as passengers filed onto the aircraft, just as Thomas Chen settled into his first-class seat with a quiet sigh of relief. The leather felt cool against his back as he loosened his tie just a bit. After a long, tiring week of high-profile cases in Washington, D.C., all he wanted was a peaceful flight home. As one of the newest judges appointed to the Supreme Court, the 52-year-old was still getting used to the busy schedule and all the attention that came with the job. Just 3 more hours, he thought to himself. Then I can see my kids and finally get some rest. He carefully placed his worn leather briefcase by his feet. Inside were important papers from a case that would change many lives across the country. He needed to keep them close. Around him, other first-class passengers were doing the same thing, putting bags under seats, asking for drinks before takeoff, and settling in for the journey. A businessman across the aisle had a laptop bag by his feet. A woman 2 rows ahead had her designer purse tucked beside her. Chen pulled out his reading glasses and a legal brief he needed to review before Monday's session. The plane was almost ready for takeoff when a flight attendant with a tight ponytail and an even tighter smile approached his row. Her name tag read Valerie. Unlike her friendly greeting to other passengers, her face changed when she reached Chen. "Sir, you need to put that briefcase in the overhead compartment right now," she said, her voice sharper than necessary. Chen looked up from his papers a bit confused. He pointed politely to the other passengers with similar items by their feet. "I'm sorry, but I noticed others have kept their personal items down here. Is there a specific reason mine needs to go up?" Valerie's face turned a shade redder. "Those are small personal items. Your bag is too big." "I understand your concern," Chen replied calmly, "but this contains sensitive Supreme Court documents that I'm responsible for. I'd prefer to keep them where I can see them." Something in Valerie's expression changed. Her eyes narrowed slightly, and her posture stiffened even more. "I don't care who you think you are," she snapped, loud enough that people in nearby rows turned to look. "You need to follow the rules like everyone else on this plane." An uncomfortable silence fell over the first-class cabin. Chen noticed a few passengers exchanging glances. An older woman across the aisle raised her eyebrows in surprise. "I understand rules are important," Chen said quietly, maintaining his composure. "Perhaps we could speak with the lead flight attendant about a solution." Instead of responding, Valerie reached down toward the briefcase. As she did, she bumped, or rather pushed, against Chen's shoulder, hard enough that his reading glasses slipped down his nose. "This needs to go up now," she said, her voice rising even higher. A few passengers gasped. The businessman across the aisle had stopped pretending to look at his phone and was now openly staring at the scene. Chen gently but firmly placed his hand on top of his briefcase. "Please don't touch my belongings," he said, his voice still, level but with a firmness that came from years in the courtroom. "I'd like your name and employee number, please." Valerie straightened up immediately, as if she'd been burned. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. "Why would you need that?" she asked, her voice still defensive but slightly less certain. "I'd like to discuss this situation with customer service," Chen replied, reaching for his phone in his jacket pocket. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding about the carry-on policy." An older flight attendant a few rows away had noticed the commotion and started walking toward them, concern on his face. But before he reached them, Valerie took a step back. "Fine. Keep your bag there." "It's not worth the trouble," she muttered, just loud enough for Chen to hear, then louder as she turned away. "Some people think they're above the rules just because of who they are." As she stormed off toward the galley, Chen noticed several passengers were still watching. An older gentleman across the aisle leaned over, slightly. "That was completely uncalled for," he whispered. "I've never seen anything like it on this airline before." Chen nodded slightly but didn't respond. He'd faced unfair treatment before, though he never expected it in first class on a major airline. He took a deep breath and looked down at his phone. He didn't want to make a scene. He never did. But after years of working in law, he knew that letting bad behavior go unchecked only allowed it to continue. He carefully took note of the time, flight number, and Valerie's name from her badge. Then, while the other passengers returned to their pre-flight routines, he opened his contacts and scrolled to a number few regular passengers would have, the direct line to the airline's executive customer service office. He glanced toward the front of the plane where Valerie was now loudly complaining to her coworkers, gesturing back toward his seat. The older flight attendant was trying to calm her down, looking increasingly concerned. Chen waited until most eyes had turned away from him. When the moment felt right, he stood up calmly and walked toward the bathroom at the front of the first-class cabin, phone in hand. He had one call to make before takeoff, and he had a feeling it would change the course of everyone's journey today. Inside the small airplane bathroom, Justice Chen took a moment to collect himself. The fluorescent light buzzed softly overhead as he looked at his reflection in the mirror. He straightened his tie and took a deep breath. In his 30 years of legal practice and 2 years on the Supreme Court, he had learned that losing your cool never solved anything. "Stay calm. Stick to the facts," he whispered to himself. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. Not the regular customer service line that most passengers would use, but a direct line to the airline's executive office. It was a contact he'd been given after joining the court, though he'd never had reason to use it until now. After 3 rings, a woman answered. "Executive Customer Relations. This is Linda speaking." "Hello, Linda," Chen said quietly. "I'm currently on Flight 372 to Chicago, and I need to report a concerning situation with a crew member." His voice was even, measured. He didn't raise his voice or use dramatic language. He simply explained what had happened, how the flight attendant had singled him out, pushed him, and spoken to him disrespectfully, while ignoring the same behavior from other passengers. "That sounds very concerning, sir," Linda replied. "Can I get your name for our report?" Chen paused for just a second. "My name is Thomas Chen, and do you have a frequent flyer number with us, Mr. Chen?" "Yes, but that's not relevant to my complaint. I believe this is a matter that needs immediate attention." There was a brief silence on the other end. "Mr. Chen, I apologize, but for our records, Justice Thomas Chen," he finally said, not out of pride but necessity. "I'm currently serving on the United States Supreme Court." The silence that followed was deafening. Chen could almost hear Linda's thoughts racing through the phone. "Justice Chen," Linda's voice had changed completely. I'm so sorry about this experience. This is completely unacceptable. If you could hold for just one moment, I need to get my supervisor on the line immediately." While on hold, Chen could hear urgent voices in the background. After less than a minute, a new voice came on the line. "Justice Chen, this is Robert Powell, Vice President of Customer Experience. I cannot express how deeply troubled I am to hear about this incident. I assure you we take this matter extremely seriously." Chen nodded, even though Powell couldn't see him. "I appreciate that, Mr. Powell. To be clear, I'm not looking for special treatment. I would be just as concerned if I witnessed this behavior, directed at any passenger. Of course, Your Honor. Rest assured we will address this immediately. The safety and dignity of all our passengers is our priority." Chen explained that he wasn't trying to cause trouble for anyone. "I just want to make sure this doesn't happen to someone else who might not have the resources or confidence to speak up." "I understand completely," Powell replied. "Would you mind if I put you on a brief hold while I contact the flight crew?" "Not at all." Back in the main cabin, Valerie was still fuming as she arranged glasses on her service cart. "Can you believe that guy?" she whispered harshly to her colleague, Ray. "Thinking the rules don't apply to him just because he's wearing an expensive suit." Ray, a flight attendant with 20 years of experience, looked uncomfortable. "Maybe you should take a minute to cool down, Val. What exactly happened?" He refused to put his oversized bag in the overhead bin, claimed it had important documents or something. She mimicked quotation marks with her fingers. "Like I haven't heard that one before." Ray frowned slightly. Was his bag actually oversized? First class has pretty generous underseat allowances. Valerie hesitated. "Well, it wasn't tiny. But that's not the point. It's about following instructions." Their conversation was interrupted by the cabin phone ringing. The lead flight attendant, Hero, answered it. His expression changed quickly as he listened to whoever was on the other end. He looked over at Valerie, then quickly away. Yes, sir. I understand. Yes, she's part of today's crew. Hero's face grew more serious with each passing second. I see. Yes, we'll handle it immediately. When he hung up, his usually friendly face was tight with concern. Val, that was the captain. He just got a call from corporate headquarters. Valerie's face paled slightly. About what? About a passenger in 3A, the one you had the disagreement with. Hero chose his words carefully. Do you know who that passenger is? Valerie rolled her eyes. Some guy who thinks he's too important to follow the rules. Hero lowered his voice. That's Justice Thomas Chen of the United States Supreme Court. The color drained from Valerie's face. What? No. He didn't say anything about being a judge. Why would he need to? Ray asked quietly. Valerie sank into a jump seat. Oh my God. I think I pushed him a little. Hero's eyes widened. You what? It wasn't on purpose. I was just trying to reach for his bag and he was in the way and... Her voice trailed off as the reality of the situation started to sink in. Meanwhile, Chen had returned to his seat. He placed his phone back in his pocket and pulled out the legal brief he'd been planning to review. To anyone watching, he appeared completely calm, as if nothing unusual had happened. But he noticed how the crew members now huddled near the galley, speaking urgently and occasionally glancing in his direction. A businessman across the aisle leaned over slightly. Everything okay? That flight attendant was completely out of line. Chen gave a small, polite smile. Thank you for your concern. I believe the situation is being addressed. The plane finished boarding, and the doors closed. The safety demonstration began, though Chen noticed Valerie was no longer part of it. Another flight attendant had taken her place. As the plane began to taxi away from the gate, Chen returned to reading his papers. He wasn't trying to get anyone fired. He just wanted to be treated with the same respect given to every other passenger. Was that too much to ask? Just as the plane reached the runway, the captain's voice came over the intercom, sounding slightly strained. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I apologize for the inconvenience, but due to an operational issue, we need to return to the gate. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We'll provide more information as soon as we can. A wave of groans and sighs swept through the cabin. Chen looked out the window as the plane made a slow turn, heading back to the terminal they'd just left. He hadn't asked for this delay. He'd simply wanted to be treated fairly. Now he couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. The plane rolled slowly back to the terminal, its engines humming quietly. Inside, passengers exchanged confused looks and checked their watches. A baby started crying somewhere in the back, and a teenager groaned loudly about missing a connection. Justice Chen remained perfectly still, his legal papers spread neatly on the tray table before him. Though his eyes were on the documents, his mind was elsewhere. He hadn't wanted to cause a scene or delay the flight. He had simply wanted to be treated with basic respect. The businessman across the aisle leaned over again. Any idea what's going on? He asked, nodding toward the front of the plane where crew members were huddled in urgent conversation. Chen gave a small shrug. I imagine we'll find out soon enough. Near the galley, the situation was tense. Hero, the lead flight attendant, was on the phone with the captain while Ray tried to calm Valerie down. This is ridiculous, Valerie whispered, her voice shaking slightly. We're delaying the whole flight because some VIP got his feelings hurt? Ray placed a hand on her shoulder. Val, this isn't about hurt feelings. You put your hands on a passenger. That's a serious issue no matter who they are. It wasn't like that, I barely touched him. Hero hung up the phone, his expression grim. That was the captain. Corporate has ordered us back to the gate. They're sending representatives to meet. The plane. Valerie's face went pale. What does that mean? Am I getting fired? I don't know, Hero said honestly. But this is bigger than just a customer complaint. The passenger you confronted isn't just any judge. He's one of the 9 Supreme Court justices. Corporate is taking this very seriously. But I didn't know who he was, Valerie protested, her voice rising slightly before Ray hushed her with a gesture toward the cabin. That's exactly the point, Ray said quietly. You shouldn't treat any passenger that way regardless of who they are. The plane finally reached the gate. The seatbelt sign dinged off, but before anyone could stand, the captain's voice came over the intercom again. Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. We've returned to the gate to address an operational issue. We ask that you please remain in your seats with your seatbelts unfastened. This shouldn't take long. Murmurs swept through the cabin as people speculated about mechanical problems or weather issues. A few pulled out their phones to check flight status apps or text family members about the delay. Minutes ticked by. Chen continued reviewing his papers as if nothing unusual was happening. He had done what he needed to do by reporting the incident. Whatever happened next was in the airline's hands. Finally, the main cabin door opened with a distinctive whoosh. Instead of the usual ground crew, 3 people in business suits boarded the plane. A tall woman with short gray hair led the group, flanked by a younger man carrying a tablet and another woman with a serious expression. The gray-haired woman spoke briefly with the captain, who had come out of the cockpit. They both glanced toward Chen, then toward the galley where the flight attendants were gathered. The captain nodded and returned to the cockpit while the 3 suit-wearing officials made their way toward the flight attendants. Passengers craned, their necks to see what was happening. The hushed conversation at the front of the plane was just quiet enough that no one could make out the words, but everyone could see Valerie's face crumbling as the gray-haired woman spoke to her. Tears welled in Valerie's eyes as she nodded stiffly. She grabbed her small personal bag from a compartment and, without looking at anyone, followed the younger man off the plane. The entire cabin fell silent as they watched her leave. Some passengers looked confused, others curious, and a few seemed to understand exactly what was happening. The gray-haired woman then approached Chen's seat, stopping at a respectful distance. "Justice Chen," she said, keeping her voice low but not whispering. "I'm Patricia Lee, Senior Vice President of In-Flight Services. On behalf of the airline, I want to personally apologize for the treatment you received today. It falls far below our standards and the respect you and every passenger deserves." Chen nodded politely. "Thank you, Ms. Lee. I appreciate your prompt response to the situation. Is there anything we can do to make the remainder of your journey more comfortable?" "No. Thank you, I just want to get home to my family." Ms. Lee nodded. "Of course, we've arranged for one of our most experienced crews to take over this flight. We should have you on your way in just a few minutes." She paused, then added, "Again, we sincerely apologize for this incident." As she walked away, Chen could feel eyes on him from all directions. The businessman across the aisle raised his eyebrows. "Supreme Court Justice, huh? No wonder they turned the plane around." Chen gave a small, slightly uncomfortable smile. He hadn't wanted attention or special treatment. He had simply wanted the same respect given to other passengers. Ms. Lee returned to the front of the plane and spoke briefly with the remaining flight attendants. Hiro nodded repeatedly, looking solemn. Meanwhile, a new flight attendant had boarded and was stowing her bags in the crew compartment. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, sounding much more relaxed this time. "Folks, thank you for your patience. We've resolved our staffing issue and will be departing shortly. Our estimated flying time remains 3 hours and 12 minutes, putting us into Chicago just about 20 minutes behind schedule. Flight attendants, please prepare for departure." As the plane pushed back from the gate a second time, Chen put away his legal papers. He hadn't been able to focus on them anyway. Outside his window, he could see Ms. Lee and her colleague standing in the terminal watching the plane leave. He thought about Valerie and felt a twinge of sympathy despite everything. He hadn't intended for her to be removed from the flight. He had simply wanted the airline to know about her behavior so it wouldn't happen to someone else, someone who might not have the confidence or means to speak up for themselves. The plane turned toward the runway again, engines revving louder this time. Chen closed his eyes and leaned back in his seat, hoping the rest of the journey would be uneventful. Little did he know, this was just the beginning of a story that would soon capture national attention. The story broke fast, faster than anyone expected. By the time Justice Chen's plane touched down in Chicago, someone had already posted about the incident on social media. A passenger in row 5 had recorded part of the confrontation on their phone and shared it online with the caption, "Flight attendant pushes and yells at black passenger. Turns out he's a Supreme Court justice." By morning, it was everywhere. News channels ran with headlines like "Supreme Court Justice Subjected to Discrimination on Commercial Flight" and "Airline Under Fire After Justice Chen Incident." The airline's stock dropped 7 points before the market had even been open for an hour. Chen woke up in his own bed, grateful to be home with his family, and opened his phone to find 63 missed calls and over 100 text messages. His wife, Dr. Lee, a pediatric surgeon, sat on the edge of the bed looking concerned. "You're trending on Twitter," she said, showing him her phone screen. The airline released a statement at midnight. Chen sighed and rubbed his eyes. "All I wanted was to come home without a fuss." Meanwhile, across town in a small apartment, Valerie sat staring at her own phone in disbelief. Her face was on every news site, captured from her social media profiles before she could make them private. The airline had released her name in their official statement, saying she had been removed from service pending a full investigation. Her phone rang. The 5th call from her mother that morning, she finally answered. "Mom, I can't talk right now. The airline's HR department is calling me in for a meeting at noon." "Honey, what happened? This doesn't sound like you at all." Valerie's voice cracked. "It wasn't like they're saying. I was just doing my job." The bag was in the way and he wouldn't move it. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Val, I raised you better than this. Did you really push a passenger?" "It wasn't a push. I reached for his bag and maybe bumped him a little." Even as she said it, Valerie knew how it sounded. "I didn't know who he was." "That shouldn't matter," her mother said softly. "Would you have treated him differently if you knew he was a Supreme Court justice?" The question hung in the air, uncomfortable and revealing. Back at Chen's home, his phone rang again. This time it was the Chief Justice calling. "Thomas, are you?" "All right, I've been seeing the news." "I'm fine," Chen assured him. "It was an unfortunate incident, but I'm home safe. The Attorney General called me. They want to know if you'd like to pursue this as a civil rights matter." Chen sat up straighter. "That seems excessive. I just filed a complaint with the airline." "Well, the video makes it look pretty bad. And you know how these things go, people are already taking sides." Chen walked to his home office window, phone pressed to his ear. Outside, he could see news vans parked at the end of his driveway, kept at bay by the security detail that came with his position. "What sides could there possibly be?" he asked. "A flight attendant treated me differently than other passengers and put her hands on me. The airline handled it. It should end there." "You know it's never that simple," the Chief Justice replied. "This is already becoming a conversation about unconscious bias in everyday interactions. Civil rights groups are calling it a textbook example of how black professionals are treated differently, even when they've reached the highest levels of success." Chen sighed. He hadn't asked for any of this. "The airline CEO has requested a meeting with you," the Chief Justice continued. "They're in full damage control mode." Across the city, in the gleaming headquarters of the airline, that damage control was in full swing. The CEO, a tall man named Gregory Wilson, paced back and forth in the conference room while his crisis management team presented options. "Our stock is down nearly 8%, said the chief financial officer. "Major shareholders are demanding answers." "What about the flight attendant?" Wilson asked. "What's her story?" The head of human resources cleared her throat. "Valerie, Thompson, 8 years with the company, generally good performance reviews. A few minor customer complaints over the years about being rigid or inflexible, but nothing that raised red flags. She's meeting with HR today. And she's claiming," "What exactly?" "That she was just enforcing carry-on policies. But sir, we've reviewed the security footage from boarding, and it's clear she wasn't applying the same standard to other passengers with similar bags, and multiple witnesses confirm she pushed Justice Chen." Wilson rubbed his temples. "So we have a PR disaster and a legitimate complaint. Wonderful." Just then, his assistant hurried in with a tablet. Sir, Valerie Thompson is on morning television giving an interview. They gathered around the screen to watch as Valerie, eyes red from crying, spoke to a sympathetic host. I would have acted the same with any passenger breaking the rules, she insisted. I didn't even know he was a judge until after everything happened. The host nodded. So you're saying you don't believe race played any role in how you approached Justice Chen? Absolutely not. I have black friends. My roommate in college was black. This is about following safety regulations, not race. Back in his home, Chen watched the same interview with a grimace. This was exactly what he'd hoped to avoid, a public spectacle where a moment of bias was being dissected on national television. His phone buzzed with a text from Ray, the flight attendant who had tried to calm Valerie down. Somehow he'd found Chen's private number. Justice Chen, this is Ray Lee. From yesterday's flight, I want to apologize again for what happened. Some of us are trying to organize a meeting between you and Valerie. We think there could be a learning moment here. Would you consider it? Chen stared at the message for a long moment. His first instinct was to say no, to try to put this whole incident behind him. But 30 years in law had taught him that sometimes the hardest conversations were the most necessary ones. He began to type a reply just as his assistant called with news that civil rights organizations were planning a protest outside the airline's headquarters, demanding broader changes in how flight staff were trained. What had started as one uncomfortable moment on a plane was quickly becoming a national conversation about race, respect, and the subtle ways bias could show itself, even at 30,000 feet. 3 weeks passed and the story showed no signs of fading away. If anything, it had grown bigger, touching a nerve in the national conversation about how people treat each other. What had started as one uncomfortable moment on a plane had become something much larger. Justice Chen sat in his office at the Supreme Court, looking out at the rain falling on Washington, D.C. A stack of letters sat on his desk, hundreds of them from people across the country sharing their own stories of being treated differently because of how they looked. He had read every single one. His clerk knocked gently on the door. Justice Chen, the car is ready whenever you are. Chen nodded, gathering his papers. Today was the day he had finally agreed to meet with airline representatives at their headquarters. He hadn't wanted to do it, but after talking with his wife and colleagues, he decided it might help turn this difficult moment into something positive. Is the press still camped outside? He asked his clerk. Yes, sir. Security will take you through the back way. Chen sighed. No. I'll use the front entrance. I have nothing to hide. 20 minutes later, his car pulled up to the gleaming glass building that housed the airline's corporate offices. As expected, reporters and camera crews swarmed the entrance. Chen stepped out of the car, straightened his tie, and walked calmly through the crowd, offering only a polite good morning to the shouted questions. Inside, airline CEO Gregory Wilson waited in the lobby to greet him personally. Justice Chen, thank you for coming. I can't tell you how much we appreciate this opportunity. Chen shook his hand firmly. Let's be clear, Mr. Wilson. I'm not here for a photo opportunity or to help with your company's image. I'm here because I believe we have a chance to create real change. Wilson nodded seriously. Absolutely. That's exactly why we wanted this meeting. They rode the elevator to the top floor, where a conference room had been prepared. Chen was surprised to see not just executives but also a diverse group of flight attendants, including Ray from his flight, and sitting nervously at the far end of the table was Valerie. She looked different now, smaller somehow, without her uniform and confidence. Her eyes were fixed on the table as Chen entered. Wilson gestured to the group. Justice Chen, we've gathered key people from across our company. Following your experience, we've spent the past 3 weeks completely rethinking our approach to training. A woman in a sharp business suit stood up. Justice Chen, I'm Dr. Lopez, the airline's new Chief Inclusion Officer. My team has developed a comprehensive program addressing unconscious bias in customer interactions. Chen listened as she outlined the changes: new training modules, revised policies, regular workshops, and accountability measures. It was thorough, thoughtful work. When she finished, Chen nodded. This sounds promising, but policies alone don't change behavior. Real change happens when people understand why these issues matter. That's exactly right, Dr. Lopez agreed. Which is why we'd like to ask for your help. Would you consider speaking at our leadership conference next month? Your perspective would be invaluable. Chen hadn't expected this request. He glanced around the table, his eyes eventually landing on Valerie, who still hadn't looked up. I'll consider it, he said finally. But first I'd like to hear from your flight attendants. They're the ones on the front lines every day. Ray spoke up first, describing the challenges of managing different passenger expectations while maintaining safety and order. Others shared similar stories, the daily struggle of balancing rules with human connection in a high-stress environment. Finally, there was an uncomfortable silence as everyone looked toward Valerie. She cleared her throat and slowly raised her eyes. I've spent every day since the incident thinking about what happened, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. At first I was defensive. I told myself I was just doing my job, that I would have treated anyone the same way. She paused, taking a deep breath. But when they showed me the security footage of how I treated other passengers with similar bags, I couldn't deny it anymore. I treated you differently and I didn't even realize I was doing it. Tears welled in her eyes. I've completed every bias training program they offered, even on my days off. I've read books, watched documentaries, talked to therapists, and the hardest part was facing the truth, that I had these assumptions in me that I didn't even know were there. The room was completely silent now. Chen studied her face, seeing genuine remorse. Mr. Chen. Justice Chen, Valerie continued, I'm not asking for my job back. I'm not even asking for forgiveness. I just want you to know that what happened changed me. I see things differently now, and I'm truly sorry for how I treated you. Chen nodded, slowly. Thank you for your honesty. That's a good start. The meeting continued for another hour, with detailed discussions about implementation and measuring the effectiveness of the new programs. As it wrapped up, Chen agreed to speak at the airline's leadership conference with one condition. I'd like Valerie to be there too, he said, surprising everyone. If we're going to talk about learning and growth, let's show what that actually looks like. 6 months later, Chen found himself boarding another flight on the same airline. He had given his speech at their conference, sharing the stage with Valerie in a powerful session that had since been viewed online more than 2 million times. The airline had made substantial donations to civil rights legal defense funds and established a scholarship for minority students pursuing careers in aviation. As Chen settled into his seat, a familiar face appeared beside him. It was Valerie, now back on limited flight duty after completing her retraining. Good evening, Justice Chen, she said professionally, though her eyes showed recognition. Can I get you anything before takeoff? A passenger across the aisle noticed the interaction and whispered to their seatmate. Someone a few rows back held up a phone recording the moment. Chen smiled politely. Just water, thank you. Valerie nodded and moved on to the next passenger, treating everyone with the same respectful attention. Later, when the video of their brief professional interaction went viral, people would call it a powerful moment of reconciliation and growth. News programs would analyze it as an example of how difficult conversations could lead to meaningful change. But in that moment on the plane, it was simply two people acknowledging each other's humanity, a small interaction that represented something much bigger. It wasn't about forgetting what had happened, but about learning from it and moving forward one conversation at a time.